Vaccines are 100% safe. In my practice, I follow the American Academy of Pediatrics vaccination schedule, and all of my patients, 100% of them, are vaccinated on time. Vaccines protect children from infant mortality.
Are vaccines really the panacea for infectious diseases we've been told? Are the side effects vanishingly small as the experts have proclaimed? Or have we been misled by a pharmaceutical industry blinded by profits? We've already seen that as far as infant mortality rate, vaccines don't seem to be lowering it. In fact, the United States of America, which vaccinates the most, has one of the highest infant mortality rates of all OECD countries. But maybe vaccines aren't the cause. Let's keep an open mind and explore the topic. Here's what the health experts have to say.
Occasionally there's an adverse reaction, but it is so rare that it's to be almost unmeasurable.
I tell parents that vaccines are safe and effective, and they're held to high safety standards. I also tell parents that there's no evidence to suggest that vaccines have any long-term harm, and that the risks of getting disease if they're not vaccinated far outweigh any risks of the vaccine itself.
The vaccines that the children are getting today are very much more pure and are very safe and effective.
In fact, vaccines have been shown to be remarkably safe and remarkably effective. There is no such thing as 100% safe or 100% effective. But the good news is, with childhood vaccines, we're about as close to that as we can get.
Did you hear that? They're about as close as we can get to 100% safe. Oh yes, vaccines are wonderful, protecting us from horrible diseases with no consequences. Just amazing. Then why are so many parents refusing to vaccinate their children? And can we trust these experts? After all, the same big pharma companies that make vaccines have been caught in such immoral acts as hiding trial data, which negatively reflects on the effectiveness and safety of their drugs. And even worse, intentionally manipulating data to cover up evidence of severe side effects. All in the name of profit. So do these profit-driven immoral companies suddenly become saints when it comes to vaccines? Let's hear from the other side of the debate.
And by the way, vaccines cannot be made safely. This is what Wyatt said. They are unavoidably unsafe. That phrase, unavoidably unsafe, is actually in the statute, and it's in the Supreme Court decision. You cannot make a vaccine safely. This is what the industry was saying.
Finding your baby dead in his crib is a horrible thought, but it's reality for 3 North Idaho families who found their infant sons dead last fall.
While the government says there's no proof the deaths are associated with the vaccines, KXLY4's Kalai Chalk introduces us to one mother who is adamant the vaccines killed her baby.
Yeah, Shelley Walker says the vaccinations her son Vance got 2 days before he died killed him. And though the government might be willing to acknowledge Vance's death and compensate Shelley for her loss, it is not willing to accept any blame. Shelley's story is tough to hear, but she's given us permission to use the 911 call she made the morning she found Vance in order to help share her story.
Come on, honey. I'm right here again. Ma'am? Jesus.
Ma'am? Shelley Walker made this 911 call September 15th. After finding her 4-month-old son Vance in his crib, unresponsive and limp.
Your baby's not breathing.
Blood crusted under his eyes and a dark foam coming from his mouth onto the teddy bear blanket lying beside him.
He's so cold. Please, dear God, what's taking him so long?
Medics arrived on scene minutes later and rushed Vance to Kootenai Medical Center.
And I had knelt down and I yelled into his ear. I said, Vance, don't you quit. Don't you give up on me. You fight. And at that point, when I looked up, the doctor was shaking his head like that and said that Vance was gone and that he'd been gone for several hours.
Shelley says she immediately thought of the vaccines Vance received just 2 days before.
And at that point, I don't know if they had picked him up and handed him to me. I just know that I had him in my arms, and I held him up and I said he was so big and strong and healthy. Was this the damn vaccines? Was this the vaccines?
A Perth couple whose daughter was left severely brain damaged after receiving last year's flu vaccine has spoken publicly for the first time of the medical blunder that has shattered their lives. After Saba Button's shocking reaction to the flu vac, the program was axed, but not before dozens of other infants were given the shot.
Hello. Hi.
This time last year, Saba Button had just taken her first 3 steps, spoken her first 3 words. She was a beautiful, thriving 11-month-old.
She loves dancing.
Then one Monday afternoon in April, on the recommendation of the health department, this completely healthy toddler had the flu jab.
The happiness and the easygoingness of our family has been destroyed. Saba had her vaccination at around 12:30 that day, went home and seemed to be fine throughout the afternoon. By 8 o'clock that night, she was moaning softly. We could only just hear it on the monitor in her bed. She had a temperature of 40.2 degrees. She was totally despondent and listless.
Saba was in the fight of her little life.
But on the second day, and it's also important to say that we were told all her organs shut down, and we were told to come and say goodbye to our little girl.
Get your family in because she might not make it.
Within about 3 days after that he started to have hives and welts and joint swelling.
Leo Smith was a year and a half old when he had a bad reaction to a vaccine, and tonight his mother is sharing his story for the first time. A federal vaccine court awarded him damages for serious injury.
And new at 5, 10 News reporter Michael Chen found out the backlash from the measles outbreak has prompted his mother to come forward.
This video of Leo Smith was shot about 8 months after he received 2 vaccine injections, including one for diphtheria and whooping cough, hours after getting the vaccines.
An injection site reaction that was red.
Leo's mother, Amy Minton Smith, says within days he had hives, joint swelling, and a fever, and within weeks, seizures. Doctors told her the cause was a rare vaccine reaction.
1 in a million is what she said.
2 months after the injections, the symptoms subsided, but Leo stopped talking. 8 months later, the original symptoms returned after Leo caught a cold. This time, Leo developed an eye tic soon after he was diagnosed with autism and later other neurological disorders like Tourette's syndrome. His mother says she feels constant guilt.
I thought I was protecting him by taking him in to get his vaccines, and I ended up injuring him for the rest of his life.
If those stories aren't enough, there are whole websites and a Facebook page where you can read countless stories from parents who claim their child, too, was injured by vaccines. Some of the posts include videos where you can see obvious evidence of seizures and other effects that indicate neurological damage. So what's the deal? Are they safe, or are we being lied to? To begin our journey, we need to know the basic kinds of vaccines and how they are made. Some vaccines contain live viruses, which are weakened so that they cannot reproduce well within the body and therefore not cause illnesses. Weakened virus vaccines include the MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella, rotavirus, oral polio, chickenpox, and some forms of the influenza vaccine. Other vaccines contain inactivated or killed viruses, or even just part of the virus or bacterium. The viruses are often killed with a chemical such as formaldehyde. But you might ask, where do they get these viruses from? That's a good question, and the answer is that they are grown in cells or cell cultures. such as egg cells for influenza or monkey kidney cells for polio. Sometimes the virus or bacterium is grown in a cell culture medium that may include such appetizing ingredients as fetal lung tissue, fetal diploid fibroblasts, bovine serum, human serum albumin, yeast DNA, human and animal DNA, and other foreign proteins. Now you may be wondering, if we grow vaccines in animal cell cultures, could vaccines possibly get contaminated with animal viruses? If you had that thought, congratulations, you are correct. The most famous example of this was the SV40 virus, a cancer-causing virus native to monkeys that contaminated the injectable polio vaccine between 1955 and 1963 when it was finally identified and removed. Before the virus was removed, approximately 98 million Americans received this vaccine. If you think this is a thing of the past, think again. More recently, pig viruses have been found in the rotavirus vaccine. Alright, well, if that's not enough to whet your appetite, here are some other ingredients that are used in vaccine production and may end up in the final product. First, we've got detergents such as polysorbate 80, sodium deoxycholate, and octazinol 10. Next up is antibiotics such as gentamicin sulfate, neomycin, and polymyxin B. Other ingredients such as formaldehyde, hydrocortisone, ammonium thiocyanate, MSG, and a whole lot more. That's right, these are just a few of the ingredients which may be in vaccines. And if you don't believe me, just do a Google search for CDC vaccine ingredients and look for yourself. Of course, the official line is nothing to worry about because these ingredients are found in such small amounts that they shouldn't be dangerous. But you got to admit it's still a little bit disturbing that they're in the vaccines at all. But actually, surprisingly enough, I've left out the most controversial ingredient of them all, the adjuvant. You see, vaccines which contain killed viruses or just part of the virus don't really excite your immune system, so your body doesn't create many antibodies when exposed to them. But if you attach a toxic material to the viral particle, such as mercury or aluminum, then the immune system will take notice and make plenty of antibodies. Here's how Robert Kennedy Jr. explains it.
Early on, vaccinologists expressed a preference for dead virus vaccines which do not shed virus. The problem was the dead virus vaccines also did not provide a robust or a durable antibody response. So you would get a little bit of an antibody response. They would cut the viruses into pieces or attenuate them. They would kill them in a way, then they'd inject them, and your body would recognize them as foreign and create an antibody response, but it wasn't enthusiastic enough. And what they found out, they discovered very early on, if you add something horrendously toxic to that vaccine, that your body, your immune system associates that toxic component with the viral antigen, the viral particle, and it says, holy cow, this thing is really dangerous. We're going to remember it next time, and we're going to go to war with next time we see it. And you get a good antibody response.
So just to recap, adjuvants are substances put into vaccines to create a more robust immune system response to dead viruses. Let's take a look first at the adjuvant thimerosal, which contains mercury. First, here's the standard pro-vaccine explanation as to why it's nothing to worry about.
Some flu vaccines that do contain it have about 25 micrograms of mercury per dose. That's the same amount of mercury in a 3-ounce can of tuna. But on top of that, the type of mercury found in thimerosal is different than the type that can make fish dangerous to eat. It gets broken down in our bodies far more quickly.
Interesting. Thimerosal, nothing to worry about. Not only is it the same amount as in just one can of tuna, it's a good kind of mercury. The kind that just comes right out of us. Well, on second thought, that cozy explanation does sound a little bit fishy, pardon the pun. I mean, come on. Mercury is toxic after all, and it's not like they just whipped up some miracle mercury that doesn't affect your body. If you dig into the scientific literature, you will see exactly that. Mercury is toxic, including ethyl mercury, and does harm your body. So here are some of the scientific studies showing it to be dangerous. Mitochondrial toxin. Neurotoxic effects. Here's one that tested thimerosal and concluded that neonatal exposure to thimerosal-containing vaccines might induce excitotoxic brain injuries, leading to neurodevelopmental disorders. Here's another study on changes in rat brains after thimerosal exposure. According to the study, these findings document neurotoxic effects of thimerosal at doses equivalent to those used in infant vaccines or higher in developing rat brain, suggesting likely involvement of this mercurial in neurodevelopmental disorders. So you see, there is evidence that thimerosal is dangerous, but you'd have to dig into the scientific literature to know that. And we must remember, they say the amount is equivalent to the amount in a can of tuna, which sounds like no big deal. But what they don't point out is that infants receive multiple vaccinations at the same time, so the amounts add up. Luckily, thimerosal was removed from all infant vaccines back in 2001. It can still be found in the multi-dose flu vaccines, but there are versions of the flu vaccine without it. So basically, mercury in vaccines is not a big problem today because they removed it from most of them. So let's move on to the other big adjuvant, which is still used in many vaccines today.
They found that if you could add some substances to these toxoids, you could kind of do the same thing. You get a better immune reaction from the body, and those are called adjuvants, and they're actually really critical to vaccines today.
The adjuvant used in that first diphtheria vaccine was a form of aluminum, which is still in certain vaccines today. It's not in the measles vaccine, but it is in DTaP, which is one for diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. The amount of aluminum, however, is really small. And aluminum is in a lot of other products we consume, including antacids and some baby formulas.
Oh, we've heard that one before, haven't we? It's just a tiny amount. Hell, it's in our diet. Come on, guys, calm down. Nothing to worry about, okay? Well, once again, how about we check in with the science before we accept that rosy picture of reality? In the most comprehensive review of the literature to date, citing over 100 references, Tomljanovic and Shaw explored the toxic effects of aluminum adjuvant on the human body. In the abstract, they state, the notion that aluminum in vaccines is safe appears to be widely accepted. Experimental research, however, clearly shows that the aluminum adjuvants have a potential to induce serious immunological disorders in humans. In particular, aluminum in adjuvant form carries a risk for autoimmunity, long-term brain inflammation, and associated neurological complications, and may thus have profound and widespread adverse health consequences. Moving along in the article, the introduction states that a growing number of studies have linked the use of aluminum adjuvants to serious autoimmune outcomes in humans. Speaking on the aluminum toxicity in animals and humans, they say, aluminum is a well-demonstrated toxin in biological systems, whose more specific impacts on the nervous system have been widely documented. And one more quote concerning the difference between dietary aluminum and the adjuvant aluminum when it comes to toxicity. They state, it is worth noting that unlike dietary aluminum, of which only 0.25% is absorbed into systemic circulation, aluminum from vaccines may be absorbed at nearly 100% efficiency. It is also important to note that ionic aluminum will not have the same toxicokinetical properties as aluminum bound to an antigen. While ionic aluminum may be excreted via the kidneys, the sizes of most antigen aluminum complexes are higher than the molecular weight cutoff of the glomerulus, likely precluding efficient excretion of these compounds. Indeed, effective excretion would in fact obviate the basic reason that adjuvants are used at all. For all these reasons, vaccine-derived aluminum has a much greater potential to induce neurological damage than that obtained through diet, even in those with effective renal function. In addition, adjuvant aluminum can gain access to the central nervous system, as demonstrated by Redhead et al., who showed that intraperitoneal injection of aluminum-absorbed vaccines in mice caused a transient rise in brain tissue aluminum levels, peaking around the second and third day after injection. In other words, these adjuvants are toxins that can cause, among other problems, brain damage. We know that certain disorders of the brain are on the rise, like learning disabilities, ADHD, and especially autism. But that's not all. There is evidence that chronic fatigue syndrome, diabetes, asthma, allergies, as well as more rare autoimmune conditions such as Guillain-Barré syndrome and multiple sclerosis can be caused or exacerbated by vaccines. Oftentimes, the connection between vaccines and these conditions is not made by doctors, either because it takes a while after the vaccine is administered for the illness to fully manifest, or because it's brushed off as a coincidence, something that would have happened anyway. Another possible reason doctors wouldn't make the connection is because they are taught that vaccines are very safe and injuries from them are extremely rare. Richard Moskovitz, author of Vaccines: A Reappraisal, points out that it's not necessarily a problem of any particular vaccine per se, although they can all cause side effects, but rather the vaccination process as a whole, so that one or two vaccines might not cause problems, but the more we pile on and add to the schedule, the risk for adverse reactions and development of chronic illnesses increases. In his own words, he says, "Most of the adverse effects of vaccines that I have witnessed in my own patients represent a wide variety of non-specific reactions to vaccination and take the form of an easily recognizable pattern of the patient rather than a statistically significant effect of any particular vaccine. By no means necessarily minor or trivial, they encompass the same broad spectrum of ailments seen in every general pediatric practice, including asthma, eczema, sinusitis, allergies, ADHD, learning and behavior problems, autism, and so forth." From reading his book, it really seems like through vaccination we are trading off one set of diseases, infectious diseases, for another, chronic diseases. Why this is so is somewhat of a mystery, but may have to do with the atrophy and reprogramming of the immune system by the process of vaccination, but more on that later. What really drives this point home are studies comparing fully vaccinated children with fully unvaccinated children. Unfortunately, these types of studies are very rarely done, but the ones that we do have vindicate Moskovitz and seem to show that children who are unvaccinated are all around healthier than their vaccinated peers. First, there was a study in New Zealand which surveyed the parents of 635 children regarding vaccination and health outcomes in the first 5 years of a child's life. We can see in this first graph that the parents of unvaccinated children reported a lot fewer incidences of convulsions, aggressive behavior, inflammation of the throat, ear infection, and fever. In the next graph, you can see that the unvaccinated visited the doctor less and had many fewer problems with ear, nose, and throat, as well as persistent crying. And finally, the last chart shows once again that overall health of the unvaccinated is much better than the vaccinated. Another study was done by Hooker and Miller. They studied children in the United States and found that unvaccinated children had fewer cases of developmental delay, asthma, and ear infection. Incidences of gastrointestinal disorder and head injury were not statistically different between the groups. The CDC, for their part, should be very interested in conducting a large-scale fully vaccinated versus fully unvaccinated study in the USA. The United States of America provides the perfect setting for conducting such a study, as it's a first world country where most children are vaccinated, but has a growing minority of children who are not due to parental exemptions based on religious faith or personal philosophy. In fact, the CDC should be overjoyed to do such a study, if for nothing else to finally put the nail in the coffin of anti-vaxxers. That is, if you believe what they say is true, namely, that vaccines are overwhelmingly beneficial and have vanishingly rare side effects. Investigative reporter Cheryl Atkinson actually contacted the CDC after she found out that the unvaccinated Amish community in the U.S. had very low rates of autism. She suggested that they study unvaccinated children in the USA and compare them to vaccinated children to either confirm or dispel a link between vaccines and autism. The CDC official non-committally agreed that somebody should do it, but it was clear from the phone call that the CDC had no such plans to do the study. Cheryl then states that the former head of the National Institutes of Health and member of the Institute of Medicine, Dr. Bernadine Healy, suggested that federal officials don't want to do such studies. In an interview with me several years ago, she said that many of her colleagues had been too quick to dismiss evidence of the vaccine autism link because they were afraid of where it might lead and how it would impact vaccination rates globally. In other words, they're content being blissfully ignorant of the truth. They don't want to know. The fallout from such a study could be disastrous for the CDC, pharmaceutical companies, and global vaccination rates. So why take the risk? So do you think the CDC will ever come off its high horse of vaccine safety and actually do a vaccinated versus unvaccinated study to prove themselves right or wrong? Will you direct the CDC to do the investigation, sir? But the study needs to be done. Well, thank you, Mike Pence. I don't think so either. But what about the argument that vaccines protect us against life-threatening infectious diseases that ravaged populations of the past and killed millions? We surely don't want a resurgence of those diseases, do we?
Why are kids getting so many more shots than we did as kids? Because vaccines work, and modern medicine has been successful in creating more of them. They prevent horrible, serious infections, diseases you do not want your child to have. Thank goodness there are so many shots.
Oh, thank goodness. Look at how many shots we have on the schedule. We are super protected. I mean, thank goodness there's so many, right? I might as well just stop the video right here because, I mean, you listen to these people speak and it's like vaccines are sent from heaven. Oh, they're so great. Let's get 1,000 of them. Let's get a shot every week. But anyway, back to a more serious tone. Let's take a gander down the CDC recommended vaccination schedule and try and decide, do we really need this vaccine? You can see the first vaccine given at birth is the hepatitis B vaccine. The CDC shows prevalence rates for hepatitis B for the USA from 2013 through 2017. They go through the rates for each state and at the bottom display the overall totals. As can be seen, hepatitis B affects about 1 person per 100,000. So the first question is, why vaccinate all infants, the very day they are born nonetheless, for a disease that very few are even at risk for? Hepatitis B can be passed from mother to child, but very few children are at risk for this. Wouldn't it make more sense just to test the mothers beforehand and only vaccinate those children who are at risk? Hepatitis B is a disease mainly acquired later in life through certain kinds of sexual activity and drug use. So it doesn't seem practical at all to mass vaccinate newborn babies against the disease. Similarly, if we skip down to the bottom of the list of recommended vaccines, hepatitis A, spread often through fecal-oral contact, it's also a disease that affects a very small subset of the population, mainly homeless people who live in unsanitary conditions, injection drug users, and people engaged in certain kinds of sexual activity. So again, the question that begs answering is, why would we inoculate the entire population against a disease that very few will ever encounter and one that is very preventable without a vaccine? Well, next up on our list is the rotavirus vaccine. Rotavirus causes diarrhea and usually spreads from fecal-oral contact. This normally happens because of poor hand washing or from consuming contaminated food or water. So essentially, as we'll see with a lot of other diseases we have vaccines for, it's a disease caused by uncleanliness. In developed countries, such as the USA, it is rarely fatal. The CDC itself admits that before vaccination was implemented, it only accounted for 20 to 60 deaths in children per year. Certainly not a health emergency we need a vaccine for. And continuing down the list of the CDC recommended vaccination schedule, we have the DTaP vaccine, which is short for diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. Diphtheria, first, is a disease caused by a bacterial microorganism which produces a toxin. It can result in a thick gray membrane covering your throat, thereby constricting your breathing and making it harder to swallow. We can see in this graph that the mortality rate of the disease had been decreasing long before a vaccine ever came into common use. This was probably due to improving cleanliness, hygiene, and living conditions, combined with the antitoxin that was used to treat it early on. It is very rare in the USA today, with only 2 cases reported between 2004 and 2015. Going back further, there were only 41 cases in the USA between 1980 and 1995. However, 10% of those cases were fatal. With such a high fatality rate, this is one of those diseases where it's probably good to have a vaccine. Tetanus is caused by another bacterium, most often found in soil or manure. Most of the time it's benign, but on rare occasions when conditions are just right, it can get into a puncture wound and release a neurotoxin that interferes with nerves that control muscle movement. It can cause muscle spasms, stiffness in the chewing muscles, and a host of other unwanted symptoms. It has never been very common, and the number of deaths from it had been dropping well before a vaccine came into common use during World War II. In any event, careful wound hygiene, especially cleaning of the wound before it is allowed to close, will normally prevent infection. Next, pertussis, also known as whooping cough on account of the severe bouts of coughing it can cause, is a respiratory disease which also had a sharply dropping mortality rate well before a vaccine ever came into play. This prompted epidemiologist C.C. Dower in 1943, when the vaccine was just starting to gain widespread use, to surmise that if mortality continues to decline at the same rate during the next 15 years that it did during the past 15 years, it will be extremely difficult to show statistically that this prophylactic procedure had any effect in reducing mortality from whooping cough. Pertussis cases have actually shown a comeback in the United States. The good news is, though, that the fatality rate is very low. In 2012, for instance, the CDC recorded 48,277 cases, but only 20 deaths among them. In 2019, there were 15,662 cases, with only 9 reported deaths. Interestingly, out of these cases, 38.1% had been fully vaccinated, suggesting that the vaccine is starting to fail, probably due to mutations in the bacterium which cause the disease. Nevertheless, the point remains, pertussis in today's world is rarely fatal and is probably no longer a disease which requires mass vaccination. The HIB vaccine protects against Haemophilus influenza type B, which is not related to the flu. It is a bacterial infectious disease which mostly affects young children under the age of 5. It can cause pneumonia and meningitis, among other complications. In the United States, around 1,000 children died annually of the disease before vaccination was introduced. Since vaccination started, the incidence of this disease has reduced dramatically. The PCV13 vaccine protects against 13 strains of the pneumococcal bacteria, which is a common cause of minor ailments like ear infections, bronchitis, and sinusitis. However, it can cause more serious diseases such as pneumonia and meningitis. The vaccine, however, only protects against 13 of the 90 known serotypes, or strains of the bacteria. So again, we have the problem of bacteria which can mutate and become vaccine resistant. So even if you do get the vaccine, you're not fully protected against the bacteria responsible for these diseases. This is not to downplay the significance of the vaccine in reducing rates of infection, but merely to point out its limitations. If we take a look at the incidence rates of invasive or serious pneumococcal infections, you'll see that it's most common in the very young and the very old. 17.7 out of every 100,000 infants under the age of 1 came down with a serious pneumococcal infection in the United States, with a death rate of 0.2 per 100,000, which equates to 2 deaths out of every 1 million infants under the age of 1. We see a similar low death rate for all age groups until old age, when the death rate increases steadily. The next recommended vaccine is the IPV or inactivated polio vaccine. Polio can cause paralysis, which is usually only temporary, but can last in some cases. Polio is another one of those diseases caused by lack of hygiene and sanitation. According to Medical News Today, the polio virus usually enters the environment in the feces of someone who is infected. In areas with poor sanitation, the virus easily spreads from feces into the water supply or by touch into food. We can see in this graph the death rate from polio in the United States from 1910 to 2008. We can see that the death rate from polio was already well under 1 per 100,000 people by the time the vaccine came around, and the death rate subsequently plummeted to 0. However, this is not the full story on polio. Diseases with symptoms very similar to polio, caused by similar viruses, are on the rise today. In the United States, this is called acute flaccid myelitis or acute flaccid paralysis, and in this chart you can see case numbers from August 2014 through June of 2020. Similarly, in India, there has been a spike in cases of non-polio acute flaccid paralysis. In an article published in the Indian Journal of Medical Ethics in 2012, Neetu Vashist and Jacob Palil state that, while India has been polio-free for a year, there has been a huge increase in non-polio acute flaccid paralysis, or NPAFP. In 2011, there were an extra 47,500 new cases of NPAFP. Clinically indistinguishable from polio paralysis, but twice as deadly, the incidence of NPAFP was directly proportional to doses of oral polio received. In other words, while polio may have been eradicated, a similar but more deadly virus just took its place. In any event, it seems that polio is an entirely preventable disease just based on ensuring good hygiene, hand washing, and a clean water and food supply. Influenza is the next vaccine on the chart. This is an interesting one because we've known for a long time that the flu vaccine is only between 20 to 60% effective in any given year. There is still a considerable chance you'll get the flu due to the many strains that are out there, of which the vaccine only covers a few. Furthermore, there has been a study indicating that if you get the flu shot, you are more likely to get a different respiratory virus. In a study by Benjamin Cowling et al., they did a placebo-controlled trial of 115 children, 69 of which received the inactivated influenza vaccine, and 46 received a placebo. Their results are startling, showing very little difference in rates of acquiring influenza, and more disturbing, showing increased rates amongst those who got the vaccine for developing a non-influenza respiratory virus. Next comes the MMR vaccine. Measles is a viral infectious disease that was once ubiquitous in the United States. We can see in this graph that the death rate was already incredibly low and had been on a steady decline for decades before the vaccine was introduced. Still, although most children recovered just fine from the illness, it was responsible for around 400 deaths per year in the United States in the years immediately preceding vaccination. Mumps and rubella, the other two components of the vaccine, have much lower fatality rates. As you can see in this chart, there were only around 39 deaths per year in the United States from mumps preceding vaccination, and even fewer deaths from rubella. Next is the varicella or chickenpox vaccine. Chickenpox is another one of those illnesses which used to be a common occurrence among children and very rarely fatal. According to the American Academy of Pediatrics, before the vaccine came out, there were around 4 million cases per year in the United States, but only around 100 deaths. In fact, it was considered so benign that parents would often have their child go play with another child who was infected so that their child could contract the disease. This is because it's far better to get chickenpox when you are young and obtain immunity due to the increase in severity of the symptoms if infected later on in life. According to medical doctor Richard Moskowitz, the issue that has come to haunt the vaccine is that, quote, in spite of many warnings that requiring it on a mass scale would weaken the immunity that would have resulted from acquiring the natural disease, and thus promote a subsequent increase in the incidence of shingles, another form of the virus, which indeed has already occurred, with large numbers of shingles cases developing at progressively younger ages, end quote. As you can see in this study of over 6 million children, vaccination was actually shown to increase the risk of developing shingles in 1 to 2-year-olds. Regardless, chickenpox was never seen as a public health threat that required mass vaccination. The only real argument for the vaccine is to save parents money on hospital bills when their children get sick. So now that we've covered all of the diseases we are vaccinated against in the first 6 years of life, let's do a little recap with the question in mind, do we really need this vaccine? So, looking at the schedule again, the very first vaccine, hepatitis B, is only needed for a small number of infants whose mothers or maybe immediate family members test positive for the virus. The same goes for hepatitis A down at the bottom. Next, rotavirus isn't very deadly, 20 to 60 deaths per year. To put that into perspective, 10 times more children die each year in swimming pools. So we could probably get rid of that one. As far as DTaP is concerned, diphtheria, although rare, is quite deadly with a 10% fatality rate, so one could still make an argument for that one. Tetanus is another rare infection and can be prevented by good wound hygiene in most cases. Even if you do get tetanus, it can be treated with antibiotics and the tetanus antitoxin. As you can see in this graph of tetanus cases in the United States from 2009 to 2017, where the blue represents non-fatal cases, while the red represents fatal cases, no one under the age of 50 died from the disease. So as rare as it is in the first place, combined with effective treatment for it, we can toss this one in the don't need it basket. Pertussis is kind of like rotavirus, very low fatality rate. Don't need that one either. Next up, HIB, short for Haemophilus influenza type B, does actually have a higher fatality rate at around 5%, although the case rate at around 20,000 cases per year before the vaccine was introduced isn't particularly high. Still, a case could be made for this one based on its fatality rate. Moving on to PCV13, the rate of serious pneumococcal infection was quite low before the vaccine was introduced, with only around 100 cases per 100,000 children under the age of 5, or about 0.1%. The death rate for children who do come down with it is about 1 to 2%, and you can still get the infection from a different strain of the bacterium not covered by the vaccine. However, the vaccine has reduced the number of cases by about 90%, so you can decide for yourself on this one, but if you just do the math, the overall chance of getting the disease and dying from it as a child is pretty low. Moving on to the polio vaccine, this is a disease which, for all practical purposes, is still around. It just had a name change and is now called acute flaccid myelitis, or non-polio acute flaccid paralysis. Now, of course, the vaccine has done its job and gotten rid of poliovirus cases, but just like with pneumococcal disease, new serotypes or new strains pop up, and that's what we're seeing today. Regardless, the real way to win the war against this one is simply sanitation. The flu vaccine is quite debatable based on its low effectiveness rate and the possibility of increasing the likelihood of coming down with a different respiratory virus after vaccination. As far as the MMR is concerned, the only one you could really argue we need is the measles vaccine. Remember, around 400 kids used to die each year from measles. But also remember, this is 400 out of 3 to 4 million kids who were infected each year. and the rate of death had been dropping well before the vaccine was introduced. So you could argue that the death rate would have continued plummeting without a vaccine, and today there would be even fewer deaths. Varicella or chickenpox is another one you can easily consider a mild disease with a very low death rate. So low, in fact, that parents used to encourage their kids to get infected. So that concludes our summary of childhood vaccines. Now, one question in all of this you might have had is, what is all this vaccination doing to our own innate immune systems? Well, some doctors have chimed in on this question, such as medical doctor Harold Buttram, who wrote a scathing attack on vaccines in Medical Veritas. In the abstract, he states, both common observation and official statistics confirm that there have been dramatic increases in chronic physical and mental illnesses in American children, such as autism, asthma, and allergies, since the introduction of the MMR vaccine in 1978. Government health officials have denied a relationship with vaccines, but U.S. congressional hearings on vaccine safety from 1999 to December 2004 revealed a total absence of vaccine safety tests that would meet current scientific standards, so that it can be assumed that many vaccine reactions are taking place unrecognized. Prior to the introduction of vaccines, the Th1 cellular immune system of the gastrointestinal and respiratory systems served as the primary defense systems, with the Th2 humoral immune system in the bone marrow serving a secondary role. There is a school of thought that the minor childhood diseases of earlier times, including measles, mumps, chickenpox, and rubella, which involved the epithelial tissues of skin, respiratory, and/or gastrointestinal tracts, served a necessary purpose in challenging, strengthening, and establishing the dominance of Th1 cellular immune system during early childhood. Current vaccines against these diseases, in contrast, being directed at stimulating antibody production in the bone marrow, are bypassing the cellular immune system and thereby tending to reverse the roles of the cellular and humoral systems, with the former suffering from a lack of challenge. In addition, the cellular immune system is being further compromised by the powerfully immunosuppressive effects of the MMR vaccine. The time is overdue to totally rethink and redirect our current childhood vaccination program. In other words, by vaccinating, we are bypassing a significant portion of the immune response that would have occurred if we acquired the disease naturally. He seems to be saying that we are doing a disservice to our immune system by removing the challenges of past times, which strengthened it and led to better all-around health. Further on in the article, he refutes the idea that vaccines are responsible for the reduction in infectious diseases, stating, vaccine proponents would have us believe that mass vaccine programs have been largely responsible for controlling virtually all of the former epidemics of killer childhood diseases in industrialized nations. In my opinion, with the exception of smallpox and the possible exception of the polio vaccine, the facts do not bear this out. According to the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, from 1911 to 1935, the 4 leading causes of childhood deaths from infectious diseases in the USA were diphtheria, pertussis, scarlet fever, and measles. Yet by 1945, the combined death rates from these causes had declined by 95%, before implementation of mass vaccine programs. Other sources provided much the same pattern of information. Furthermore, according to a report in Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, July 30th, 1999, improvements in sanitation, water quality, hygiene, and the introduction of antibiotics have been the most important factors in control of infectious disease in the past century. Although vaccines were mentioned, they were not included among the major factors. This is not surprising. We've seen that many infectious diseases spread through poor hygiene, and that the death rates for most of them had been dropping precipitously before a vaccine was introduced. Back to the topic of the immune system, medical doctor Richard Moskowitz similarly explains just how important some of these childhood illnesses are for the development of a healthy immune system. He says, amid the impressive array of new vaccines and the noisy bullying employed to promote them, it is easily forgotten that the growth, development, and maturation of a healthy immune system is accomplished mainly by learning how to mount such acute, vigorous responses to infection, and that the challenges of coming down with and recovering from illnesses of this type are the formative experiences by which this fundamental prerequisite of good health is achieved and maintained throughout life. This basic truth is reinforced by a considerable body of epidemiological research to the effect that contracting and recovering from measles, mumps, chickenpox, influenza, and other acute childhood illnesses with fever provides significant protection against many chronic diseases later in life, including many autoimmune diseases and even cancer of various types. So is this really true? Does fighting off these illnesses naturally actually make us healthier? Better able to fight off other disease-causing antigens in the future? Less likely to get cancer or other serious illnesses, perhaps? Well, studies have shown, for instance, that the more of these childhood illnesses a person has come down with naturally and recovered from, the less likely they are to develop certain types of cancer. Here's a paper published in 1977 examining women with cancer of the ovary. It was found that significantly fewer of the women with cancer recalled an attack of mumps, measles, or rubella as a child, compared with control groups of women without cancer of the ovary. Certainly not conclusive because other factors surely come into play, but suggestive of a protective effect nonetheless. Here's another paper from 1997 exploring the association between prior infection with varicella zoster virus, which you'll remember causes chickenpox or shingles, and glioma, which is a type of brain tumor that can be cancerous. Their results show that adults with glioma were less likely than controls either to have had prior varicella zoster virus infection or to have an immunoglobulin G antibody response adequate to indicate positivity. And finally, one more study to investigate the hypothesis that febrile infectious childhood diseases are associated with a lower cancer risk in adulthood. They found that, except for breast cancer, the study consistently revealed a lower cancer risk for patients with a history of febrile infectious childhood diseases like measles, chickenpox, etc. And furthermore, the risk decreased by about 20% for each of these diseases a person had come down with as a child, so that if you only had one as a child, your risk of cancer decreased by 20%, but if you had 3 or 4 of them, your cancer risk decreased by a whopping 60%. We often forget that, yes, our immune systems do target and destroy cancer cells in our body. And those studies just go to show that a strong immune system, challenged as a child and strengthened from childhood illnesses, can help prevent cancer later in life. Studies have also shown an increased risk of asthma and allergies for those who have been vaccinated. In a letter to the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, a study of children was brought up that asked the question, "Has your child ever been diagnosed as asthmatic?" There were 30 positive answers. The surprise came when they classified the questionnaire according to pertussis vaccination. Among the 243 immunized children, 26 were diagnosed as having asthma compared with only 4 of the 203 children who had not been immunized. All of the subjects who had received pertussis vaccine received other vaccinations as well. There was only 1 case of asthma among the 91 subjects who had no vaccination at all, and only 3 cases in children who didn't get the pertussis vaccine, but did get other vaccines. Seizures. Diabetes. Bleeding disorders. All have been linked to vaccination. So, how common are adverse reactions to vaccines? The answer is we really don't know because most are never reported or causally linked to the vaccine. Officially, approximately 30,000 adverse reactions to vaccines are reported each year to the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, most of which are mild side effects. However, it is estimated that only between 1 and 10% of vaccine-related injuries are reported. so the actual number is probably 10 or even 100 times greater. One nurse shared her story of just how underreported these cases are. She says, "I have filed VAERS reports, but I am the only nurse that I have ever met that files VAERS reports. I also have never met a doctor that filed a VAERS report. Mind you, I have served in multiple hospitals across multiple states alongside probably well over 100 doctors and probably 300 to 400 plus nurses. I've worked in big hospitals like San Francisco Bay Area Metro 40-bed ER, Las Vegas, Nevada Metro 44-bed ER, and small hospitals, rural access 2-bed ER, remote community 4-bed ER, and everything in between. When I say never, I mean never. I have even made a point of sitting in the most prominent spot at the nurse's station filling out a VAERS report to make sure as many people saw me doing it as possible to generate the expected, "What are you doing?" responses to get that dialogue going with people. And in every case, if a nurse approached me, their response was, "I've never done that," or "I didn't know we could do that," or worse, "What is VAERS?" Which was actually the most common response. The response from doctors? Silence. Absolute total refusal to engage in discussion or to even acknowledge what I was doing or what VAERS was. The big takeaway from that, VAERS is woefully underreported. I am proof of that. The number one place parents bring their kids in the event of a vaccine reaction is the ER. And as an ER staffer, I have never met anyone who filed one, in spite of seeing hundreds of cases of obvious vaccine-associated harm come through. What does that say about reported numbers? The CDC HHS admits that VAERS is underreported and probably only representative of 1/10 the actual number of injuries. I can test that. And from personal experience, I would say the numbers in VAERS are more like 1/1000th of the actual numbers, not 1/10. And the final part of that is that I have firsthand seen blatant cover-ups from doctors. I have seen falsification of medical records and documentation via intentional omission. I have challenged doctors who refused to put in the chart that the child was vaccinated 4 hours ago and was in perfect health, and now suddenly they are non-responsive, seizing, febrile at 105, and that labs, LP, and imaging confirms cerebral edema/encephalitis. I reminded the doctor as they are writing their report that the child was vaccinated mere hours before, and at the end, there is total omission of this fact, and the physician pass-off notes state encephalitis of unknown origin. I asked the doctor if they will file a VAERS report, and they argue that this has nothing to do with it. It's purely coincidental, and nothing should be filed. They are safe and effective. I remind them that VAERS is a reporting body for any symptoms that are contemporaneous to vaccination, whether causation is believed to be associated or not, and I get the dismissal that they are not filing it because it has nothing to do with it. With doctors and nurses turning a blind eye to the side effects of vaccination, either passing it off as a coincidence or not even thinking to question the vaccine, we can only guess how common vaccine injuries really are. And as mentioned before, if the side effects take weeks or months to fully manifest, as might be the case in more chronic illnesses, the connection to the vaccine will be even less likely to be made. Too often, vaccines are not tested against a true placebo before they are licensed. They are tested either against another vaccine or the adjuvant, which we have shown to be toxic. The result is a masking of the true risks of the vaccine. With that said, probably the incidences of severe lasting side effects are relatively low, but we really just don't know. If vaccines were in fact overwhelmingly safe, as the CDC and pharma companies would like us to believe, then mass vaccinating for any and every disease, even if it only kills 50 kids a year, would make sense. However, in the face of growing evidence that they do cause harm, mass vaccination needs to be relegated only to those diseases we consider to be grave threats to our children. I believe every parent should be able to make that determination for his or her own child. This has been a Real Truth Media production.